January 1944. The sky over Brown County, Texas was rinsed pale blue after a night of frost. From the western horizon, trains approached with a low metallic groan, their smoke tails carving gray ribbons over the prairie. Along the rail tracks, the Army MPs waited in silence, their breath visible in the morning air. The diesel engines slowed, coughed, and stopped. Doors creaked open, and the first ranks appeared. German prisoners, men of the Afrika Korps, and alongside them, a smaller detachment of female auxiliaries, their Wehrmacht armbands torn or hastily removed. These young women, once attached to military offices in France and Italy, had been swept up during the collapsing fronts. Now, as the transport guards barked orders, they were stepping down onto American soil for the first time. The locals who gathered nearby at the station fence, housewives, farmers, postmen, watched with restrained curiosity. Some whispered prayers. They expected to see hard-faced monsters. Instead, they saw thin figures, sunburnt and frightened, their uniforms hanging loose at the shoulders. One of the onlookers, librarian Winnell Hewitt of Camp Bowie, recalled how the Germans began to sing their anthem, the sound both proud and haunting. Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. It made the hair stand on the back of my neck, she would later remember. They came walking down the street, boots clomping, heads still high, even though the war was lost for them. The column marched 3 miles through Brownwood to the internment camp gates. Behind the wire fence, 3 guard towers loomed above the flat ground. The women glanced at them, some trembling. The propaganda of the Reich had warned them about captivity in America. Stories of starvation, of humiliation, of public stripping and forced labor. They whispered to one another, "They will make examples of us." A sergeant's whistle cut through the morning air. "Fall in!" The command came through an interpreter. The prisoners formed lines. The smell of mesquite drifted from the fields. Inside, the American protocol was mechanical efficiency. Each prisoner was registered, tagged, and brought through the quarantine line. The camp medics, female nurses in olive uniforms, stood ready to conduct the first procedures. The commandant, in accordance with the Geneva Convention articles signed by the United States in 1929, emphasized privacy for all captives, male or female. But the women, accustomed to the brutal hierarchy of the Reich, did not understand this restraint. They feared exposure, degradation, vengeance. Inside the shower hall, the sound of piping echoed like thunder. The women froze under the concrete ceiling. One of them, a 22-year-old telegraph assistant named Margaret, pressed her back against the wall, her eyes wide. In her mind flashed the images of Auschwitz whispered about by defectors, showers that hissed poison instead of water. The guard at the door, a young corporal from Milwaukee, saw the panic and hesitated. Then he stepped back and turned his face away, letting the female nurse speak softly through the translator. A valve turned. Silence filled the room. Then water, clear, clean, cold, rained down from above. For an instant, no one moved. Then someone began to sob. It was not fear this time, but relief. The water struck the floor, pounding against bare concrete, a rhythm that seemed to wash away the memory of propaganda. In that moment, they realized something inconceivable. Their captors were not executioners. They were orderly, distant, restrained. For these women, it was the first sign that the world they had been told to fear might be the one that saved them. Throughout the following days, the new arrivals were issued clothing, khaki work dresses bearing the stencil PWG. They were given Red Cross sanitary kits, soap, and toothpaste. Hot coffee was served with thick slices of white bread, butter, and jam. Many hesitated to eat, expecting to seat. But when the guards merely nodded and moved along, curiosity overcame fear. The bread was soft, unlike the coarse war loaves of Germany. One woman later described the sensation as tasting peace for the first time. The rhythm of camp life followed Army precision. Réveillé at 5:45 a.m. Lights out at 10:10 p.m. Between those hours, the prisoners worked in workshops or on nearby farms, earning small wages in canteen tokens they could exchange for writing paper, cigarettes, or candy. On Sundays, they were allowed to attend religious services. American chaplains, watching their faces, remarked in diaries how disbelief gave way to quiet gratitude. But in those first weeks of captivity, the greatest transformation happened not in the daily routine, but in the silence of the nights. Lying in their bunks, the women whispered about what they had seen and what they had not seen. "They did not touch us," one said, almost in awe. "Do you think it is a trick?" another asked. In the far distance, a train whistle echoed across the plains, a long, mournful sound. To the guards, it meant transport. To the prisoners, it became the lullaby of survival. The water from that first shower, the scent of soap, and the sound of the evening train became the symbols of their new life. A sensory thread linking fear to freedom, squalor to cleanliness, uncertainty to order. Many of these women had belonged to the Wehrmacht Helferinnen, auxiliary clerks, nurses and radio operators conscripted to serve under the Reich's war machine. Captured during the Allied advance in North Africa and France, they represented the last vestige of Nazi female militancy. Yet even they, indoctrinated by years of propaganda, began to unravel under the touch of decency. American records from Camp Bowie and Camp Hearn note that discipline among female prisoners was exemplary. There were no incidents of violence or disobedience. Instead, they adapted swiftly, forming sewing groups and teaching English through small improvised schools. By the second month, the camp library reported requests for dictionaries, novels, and hymnals. The women who had marched in singing the anthem of conquest were now reading American short stories about ordinary lives. Outside the camp, the townspeople of Brownwood slowly adjusted to their new neighbors. Farmers hired POW work details under guard escort. Some women worked sorting produce or sewing uniforms in depots. Though fraternization was officially forbidden, local accounts describe moments of human connection. A guard handing a second slice of bread, a nurse staying longer than necessary at bedside checks. These gestures, though simple, struck at the heart of Nazi ideology. Because the propaganda they had been fed in Germany painted Americans as immoral barbarians, these respectful acts were unimaginable. They had expected domination, not decency. In the quiet order of the camp, their convictions crumbled. They began to question what had led them across oceans to war. Behind the fences, in the unlikeliest of places, democracy revealed its subtle power. It conquered not through iron or fire, but through fairness. Occasionally, there were moments of humor. A camp report filed in March 1944 recorded a small disturbance when several female prisoners refused to take part in agricultural labor, claiming that digging was not for women of the Reich. The American officer responded by seating himself beside them in the shade and beginning to peel potatoes. The women watched, then laughed and joined in. The entry concluded with, "Work continued thereafter without incident." The early months of their captivity became a psychological turning point. Numbed by years of indoctrination and aerial bombardment, they found in the ordinariness of camp routine a strange sanctuary. The concrete walls, bare as they were, provided something that wartime Europe could not: stability. But the memory of that first day, the hiss of water in concrete barracks, never faded. Decades later, survivors of the Texas camps would refer to that moment as the instant the war truly ended for them. Historian James Dunning noted that several post-war interviews recorded identical phrasing. It was water, not gas. Those 4 words carried the entire weight of what captivity had undone. Each night, as the guards completed rounds and the floodlights dulled into the violet Texas dusk, the sound persisted. In the distance, the residue of running water from the showers, dripping, echoing through the still air. The women listened. That sound was no longer terror. It was, instead, the rhythm of reprieve. And thus began the transformation that would span the next 2 years. A transformation not imposed by coercion, but born through ordinary respect. In Texas, behind fences and under watchtowers, captured women of a fallen regime began to discover that freedom, in its deepest sense, was not an absence of walls, but the presence of decency within them. The first night behind barbed wire in Texas was suffused with dread. Inside the hutments of Camp Bowie, German comfort girl POWs lay awake, haunted by old fears. Even after the cold water of the showers had proven merciful, voices still whispered in the darkness. "We are simply waiting for the real punishment," one young radio woman thought as she pressed a borrowed blanket closer. Propaganda lingered in the bones, a chill deeper than the winter air. In Germany, before defeat and capture, these women had received instructions from the Reich to resist Allied advances, never surrender, and believe above all that an American uniform meant humiliation. The enemy, they were told, would strip the dignity from soldiers, especially women, as retribution. He would gloat over the fallen, parade captives, force them into subhuman labor or worse. Tales circulated of Allied camps in North Africa, where German nurses were forced to scrub floors alongside prisoners from every rank and role. Warnings of brutality and shame were passed from one to the next. In truth, most had never seen an American up close. All that was left were the nightmares they'd been fed. But Texas inserted itself between the cracks of those fears. Each morning a new routine began. Reveille sounded at dawn, and the American guards, young conscripts from New York, Alabama, and Milwaukee, took their posts at a respectful distance. The camp nurses, mostly women in regulation army attire, moved quietly among the barracks, checking health with clinical detachment. No one shouted. No one made threats. While American POWs in European camps often faced torrents of abuse, forced marches, and deprivation, these German captives encountered something the Reich had never prepared them for: restraint and order so absolute it felt unreal. The emotional contrast grew stronger with each day. The women found themselves fed real meals: meat, fresh eggs, butter, white bread, and most miraculously, chocolate. Every new provision was met first with suspicion, then with awe. One woman, Elsa, kept a diary and faded pencil. "Today at lunch," she writes, "the Americans served us cake. I could feel my hands trembling as I picked up the fork. We were taught that they would spit on our food or starve us. I think my mother in Dresden would weep to see this cake." The steady rhythm of decency chipped away at Nazi despair. Even the architecture of the camp contributed to the illusion of normality. Huts were plain but not squalid. Water ran freely, windows let in sunlight. Prisoners tended gardens and worked in laundry sheds, earning modest tokens they could trade for more food, soap, or cigarettes. At midday, guards escorted work details to fields beyond the wire, where Texas farmers greeted them in an awkward silence. Some prisoners expected a hail of insults. Instead, they received instructions on how to pick cotton, and the occasional polite nod. At every turn, the old stories failed to materialize. The barracks, though modest, were clean and warm. The latrines were private. Privacy was maintained even during medical checks and hygiene routines. No American set foot inside the women's showers. The contrast between expectation and reality became so stark that some POWs wondered if they were part of an elaborate psychological experiment. One evening, Elsa records another shock. "Tonight I heard music. It was Beethoven coming from the canteen radio. I closed my eyes and remembered my sister at home, playing the same sonata. No one screamed at us to turn it off. I did not know that enemies could have love for our music. It makes me question everything." The American guards, for their part, faced their own surprises. Most had expected hardened enemies, bitter and dangerous captives. Instead, they encountered a broken cross-section of the Reich. Tired nurses, secretaries, telegraph clerks, cooks. Some bore the scars of bombing raids over German cities. Others wept nightly for children left behind. The GIs were drilled in the protocols of the Geneva Convention. No fraternization, no gifts, no jokes. But a few could not resist slipping extra meat into ration trays, or chocolate bars, or old comic strips folded in English. The distance remained, enforced by barbed wire and regulation. Yet it was a distance the American guards held fast, not out of hatred, but humility. As the months passed, the symbol of decency became a ritual. Each Saturday the showers ran hot, and the sound of water against concrete, once associated with terror, became the heartbeat of safety. Chocolate bars in their shiny wrappers carried the message even further. The food, the clean water, and the foil wrappers became tokens of restraint and quiet mercy. Simple, edible symbols of American abundance and a democracy that refused to humiliate. In conversations recorded decades later, German POWs would explain how this emotional contrast undid years of ideological indoctrination. Elsa, in her post-war interviews, said, "I feared the Americans would be monsters, but they were only men. The worst they did was turn their backs sometimes so we could change. Clothes in peace." The son of a Berlin shopkeeper described receiving aspirin from a camp nurse after weeks of migraines. He could not believe he was allowed to keep the medicine. The force of propaganda broke finally, not in speeches but in gestures. A guard returning a fallen scarf without a word. A nurse quietly refilling a pitcher of water for a sick woman. A chaplain translating a prayer with respect. These small moments accumulated, and the underlying terror began to fade as routine, boredom, and simple human contact replaced nightmare with memory. Historical records support the transformation. U.S. government archives detail the careful adherence to Geneva standards even in remote camps. Letters home from POWs, published in local newspapers, describe the strangeness of American abundance. A POW orchestra, a library with English novels, soccer matches at dusk. "They let us play Beethoven," wrote one. "They let us read English books. They treat us as people." For women raised under totalitarian discipline, the ability to choose what to work, what to read, what to eat, became the deepest shock of all. By autumn, propaganda was dying. Instead, the prisoners began to debate the meaning of what they saw. Was American kindness a form of cunning, designed to undermine loyalty? Some hardened prisoners clung to suspicion, forming cliques and repeating old slogans. But most simply embraced the new reality. Within months, hundreds of POWs had volunteered to assist in chapel services, to teach or translate, to help organize music or sports. The transformation was visible in daily life, not ideology. Personal worth rebuilt slowly, like flowers growing from cracks in cement. A poetic moment persists in the letters of Elsa. "I watched the sunlight today shine on the shower pipe, forming a thin rainbow on the wet concrete. I remember the rainbows I saw as a girl in Dresden, before the war. Here, under guard, the rainbow means something different. A promise. In this camp, the rain and the sun are not weapons. They are simply the world, and in the world, I have found mercy." Historical quotes and oral histories show that the emotional contrast reached its peak as the war closed. "Some of us learned what freedom meant only as prisoners," writes a German POW, Hans Lehner, in a letter to the camp adjutant. For a German, the uniform was everything. Now in Texas, the greatest lesson has been learning to think for myself. For the American soldiers, the daily act of respecting privacy became a discipline more difficult than their military drills. In their restraint lay a philosophy. Democracy would prove its power not through conquest, but by refusing the temptations of vengeance. The sound of running water persisted, linking every day to the original revelation. The shower as the symbol of mercy, the chocolate wrapper as the emblem of abundance, the music as the echo of freedom. So the camp became not a place of repression, but of rebirth. Every act of courtesy became a weapon against propaganda. Every day of decent routine further eroded the machinery of hate. By Thanksgiving, the comfort girls of the Reich had ceased to fear their captors. In diary entries they began to imagine a life beyond the fences. A life where dignity was not a privilege, but a simple truth, repeated in the ordinary rituals of food, water, and respectful silence. In this crucible of emotional contrast, the great ideological test of World War II was enacted not on battlefields or in speeches, but in the steady, unremarkable acts of decency inside the barbed wire. The myth of humiliation was broken by the rhythm of respect, and in that breaking, both prisoner and guard were set free by the simplest lesson. Mercy, once feared as weakness, was the strongest victory of all. There is a rhythm to captivity, slow, steady, almost meditative. Each day inside the barbed wire fences of Camp Bowie, daily life began with the same ritual. The abrupt buzz of reveille at 5:45 a.m., a wash of light on the Texas plain. German prisoners, women among them, awakened not to the command of German officers, but to the orderliness of American military time. For the comfort girls who had crossed an ocean into the unknown, this regimented normality was at first unnerving. The barracks, military standard, lined with cots and footlockers, offered shelter but little privacy. Still, the small details mattered. Windows admitted easy sunlight, pot-bellied stoves radiated warmth. American guards, indifferent yet unmistakably human, made their rounds at a distance. What struck the prisoners almost as acutely as the efficiency was its fairness. There was discipline but not cruelty. There were rules, but not humiliation. Each day water would pour from the pipes, cold and clear, a sound that slowly lost its association with terror and began to symbolize survival itself. Every week, shower day became a ritual of cleansing and rebirth. Women lined up in pairs, awaiting their turn as the pipes sputtered and hissed. Unlike in Germany, there were no officers to shout or humiliate, no civilians to gawk or jeer. Privacy, carefully observed, became an unexpected balm to wounded dignity. Inside the shower room, the laughter and cries that had once signaled despair now became music, tentative, uncertain, but alive. Beyond the barracks, work assignments filled the hours. Prisoners harvested cotton, sorted peaches, prepared uniforms, and tended gardens. Texas farmers, desperate for labor, learned to communicate through gestures and broken English. Some women, in the rhythm of fieldwork, discovered a new peace. "We picked cotton and sang German songs under the American sun," wrote Inga, a former auxiliary. "I never imagined that peace could be made with my enemy in such a way." The work was hard, but not forced, and recompense came in canteen tokens, which could be exchanged for luxuries unimaginably scarce in wartime Europe. Soap, cigarettes, even chocolate. Chocolate, that small, shining emblem of American abundance, became more than food. Passed silently from guard to prisoner, it was at once a gesture, a reward, and a message. To taste sweetness after years of rationed bitterness was to realize that victory was not always measured in blood or territory, but in civility. The crinkle of the chocolate wrapper joined the running water as a symbol of democracy. Each woman who received such a gift was forced to question everything learned under the Reich. Was dignity not reserved for the powerful? Was kindness not a weakness? Bread was soft, white, and plentiful. Butter did not need to be rationed. Coffee was served scalding hot with real sugar, not ersatz. Prisoners gathered in canteens to eat in silence, sometimes in awe, sometimes in disbelief. The enemy, who had been described as the harbinger of depravity, proved himself instead through the provision of abundance. The kitchen was perfumed each morning with the aroma of eggs, toast, and jam. Some women wept over their trays, memories of starvation under siege fresh in their minds. Outside of work, daily life expanded into educational pursuits. The camps were alive with activity. A POW-taught orchestra rehearsed Beethoven and Schumann. Theater groups staged short dramas. Soccer teams competed on rough fields. Some women found solace in the camp library, requesting dictionaries or American novels. A handful enrolled in correspondence courses, secretly dreaming of another kind of future. Letters home, censored but not forbidden, became another ritual. Each page, stamped and sealed by Red Cross officials, traveled across the Atlantic, carrying news of survival. "We are alive," one wrote. "We are living as people, not as animals." The act of writing, once forbidden under the Reich's control, became the first act of reclaiming the dignity that war had tried to strip away. Even in sorrow, democracy preserved its distance. There were deaths in the camp. Illness and heartbreak were not unknown. But the American chaplains who presided over ceremonies did so with respect. No life was profaned, no grief denigrated. The sunlit Texas fields bore witness not to vengeance, but to ritual, solemn and quiet. For many women, the emergence of personal dignity arrived slowly. Fear of the unknown gave way to trust in routine. Propaganda yielded to empirical truth. "I did not expect to survive," whispered Lotta, a camp interpreter. "Now I live by rules that make sense. In America, even prisoners are given some honor." The evolution was not absolute. Some prisoners resisted the camp's rhythms, clinging to ideology or suspicion. But for most, the slow accumulation of small mercies rebuilt a sense of self. The sound of running water and the crinkle of chocolate wrappers became mantras of transformation. Under the regime, these women had been spoken to as girls, as objects. Under American democracy, they became prisoners, persons with names and histories. The difference was subtle but profound. Historical accounts bear out these experiences. Oral histories collected decades later document the lasting impact of daily fairness. "Texas," wrote one former POW, "taught me that decency survives even war." For the guards, too, the test of restraint became a measure of country. In the discipline of kindness, they proved that democracy was more than a promise. It was a practice. The motif of abundance echoed throughout camp life. Chocolate, bread, water, even music. These items spoke not just to survival, but to transformation. Dignity, as American ideology maintained, was a right to be defended even behind barbed wire. In those long days between war and repatriation, the women of Camp Bowie found themselves changed by the rituals of ordinary American life. And beneath the hum of stoves and the music from the canteen, the quiet sound of water continued. Steady, merciful, unbroken. As the sun set on another Texas evening, a young woman paused outside the barracks. The air, heavy with mesquite, carried the distant sound of the showers mixing with laughter and song. She looked down at the chocolate wrapper in her hand, its golden shine fading in dusk. In its small gleam, she glimpsed not defeat, but possibility. This was how dignity, lost to war, was restored. Not in grand gestures, not in speeches, but in the gentle daily rhythm of respect, richness, and renewal. Human dignity after war is never rebuilt in a single moment. For the German women imprisoned as POWs in Texas, the slow restoration of worth came through humble routines, work, study, creation, and the witnessing of ordinary mercy over time. By early 1945, Camp Bowie felt less like an outpost of defeat and more a strange campus for the lessons of peace. Many of the comfort girls, telegraphers, radio operators, secretaries once tethered to the Nazi war machine, now volunteered for new assignments. Some tended gardens, sowing vegetables into neat rows behind the wire. Others worked in laundries or at the camp infirmary, cleaning sheets and preparing meals for ill POWs of all ranks. The labor was not demeaning. Rather, it rebuilt a sense of contribution, the feeling that survival depended on small, honest tasks. The canteen, too, became a social hearth. There, prisoners pooled canteen tokens, wages from their labor, for group treats, chocolate, cigarettes, canned peaches. Music played from the battered radio, its signal strong enough to catch Dallas stations when the air was just right. Saturday evenings brought rough-hewn concerts, a makeshift orchestra, comprised of whatever musicians and instruments could be assembled, played Beethoven and Schubert with shuddering beauty. For many, these concerts were the first time since 1939 that music spoke for something other than alarm or nationhood. Books and letters flowed between the camp and the outside. The POW library, modest but growing, featured English instruction manuals, novels, and hymnals. Women signed up for language classes, read aloud to each other in German and then in English, stumbling and laughing over the alien syntax. Education became an antidote to propaganda. The act of understanding a new tongue was itself liberation, a chance to reshape identity without uniforms or flags. Letter writing especially became an almost sacred ritual. Censorship was strict, but the act of writing home gave each captive a voice, not simply as a daughter of the Reich, but as a survivor and observer. "I am well," one woman wrote to her family near Bremen. "We have bread and warmth, and I have learned to play your favorite hymn on an American piano." For relatives who had spent months without word of their loved ones, every letter received was a quiet miracle. Moments of transformation were not always public. Some unfolded in the silent discipline of self-examination. At night, in the long hours after lights out, The women recounted stories of childhood, of mother tongues, of the war's great betrayals. "I look at my hands, still strong," one diarist confessed. "These hands were made to save, not destroy. In Germany, I was a cog in a mighty machine. Here, I can learn to be a person again." For some, the rhythm of labor and learning led to reconciliation with fellow prisoners of different beliefs, or even with American camp staff. Acrimony, sometimes sharp at first, dulled as shared routines revealed the falsehoods of propaganda. Few prisoners remained hardened loyalists for long. Instead, informal circles emerged. Groups gathered beneath tree shade to debate books, to braid hair, to celebrate a birthday with smuggled fruit, or to teach a friend a new word. In one extraordinary episode, oral histories describe a Christmas evening in 1945 when the women's choir performed a German carol for camp guards as snow fell thick over the Texas prairie. A moment of fragile truce, where the old landscape of fear dissolved into the recognition that all were weary, all were human. When news of the Allies' victory in Europe reached the camp, some prisoners wept. The war was over. What remained was to recover the self, one memory at a time. Psychological rebirth came most powerfully in the realization that one's worth was not tied to uniform or flag. The women of Camp Bowie learned they could exercise choice, to read, to write, to labor, to forgive. The sound of running water, once a terror, became a lullaby. The taste of chocolate, once a luxury for Aryan elites, became a shared delight. Each was a symbol: water for mercy, chocolate for abundance, bread for fairness. Long after, in individual interviews and memoirs, these women would recall that the first dignity they had known was not in Germany, but behind American wire. "For years," Marita explained, "my world was bordered by barbed wire. Yet in Texas, I received more mercy as a citizen of nowhere than I ever did as an official daughter of the Reich." This rebirth was not only for the prisoners. American soldiers, too, confronted new truths. They became witnesses to transformation, learning, in the discipline of respect and order, that democracy's greatest strength was not in arms, but in decency. By giving the enemy dignity, we remembered our own, wrote one camp chaplain. That is America's promise, even in war. So did dignity, quietly and painfully return, through letters, music, labor, friendship, and the promise found in every stream of water and every crinkled chocolate wrapper. The value of life and liberty was restored. And as the end of imprisonment neared, hope followed. The women who had once expected only shame now dreamed. Some wished to return to Germany, to reclaim homes and mend families. Others had seen enough of old hatreds and would apply for passage to new countries, determined to shape their fate. The journey from propaganda to rebirth, from despair to fragile dignity, echoed every day in Camp Bowie. It lived in a song, a kind word, a candle lit for Christmas, the silent exchange of chocolate, the sound of a pipe running clean, cold water through the Texas dusk. There, dignity was not granted by the accident of birth or the power of ideology. It was won anew every day by the courage to live, to learn, and to hope inside the fences of a distant land. As spring warmed the plains of Texas, change swept across Camp Bowie. The war in Europe had ended, and with the signing of armistices, the machinery of repatriation began. Women who, months before, had disembarked from trains in terror, now gathered in small clusters beneath the open sky, waiting for news. It was a scene transformed. Beneath barbed wire, amidst the lines of cots and mess halls, a kind of fragile peace had taken root. For the German comfort girl POWs, captivity had become a journey of unlearning and renewal. Proximity to death and humiliation faded. Life was measured not in force but in the liberty offered by routine, decency, and basic rights. American democracy had asserted itself not as brute power, but as a rhythm, a sequence of fair acts that collectively became the greatest lesson of all. As departure neared, the rituals changed. Farewell letters were penned in cramped handwriting. Hymns were sung, prayers whispered. Groups gathered for one last photo, smiling with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. Some women struggled to reconcile their camp experience with the lies of the war they'd lived. "In Texas," wrote Elsa, "the fence was the border between terror and mercy. We crossed from nightmare into the steadiness of freedom." Historical records document these final days. The captives, now marked not by defeat but by resilience, left tokens behind. A hand-sewn handkerchief embroidered with Danke, a half-finished diary, a Bible scrawled with dates of birthdays and deaths. American guards, too, marked the occasion. Some gave small gifts, a chocolate bar, a photograph. For many, the farewell was bittersweet, tinged with an understanding of brotherhood born not of nationality, but of shared hardship and respect. The motif endured. When the last showers were taken and the pipes were shut off for good, the women lingered over the sound. Running water, a symbol of democratic mercy, had been present in every stage of transformation. Its echo would remain with them, linked forever to the knowledge that freedom's truest sound was not a shout, but the steady, generous flow that never humiliated, never denied. Their return to Germany brought further challenges. Some were met with suspicion, others with sympathy. Yet all carried in memory the contradiction of American captivity. The lessons of mercy learned in Texas became stories quietly shared. Water that cleansed but did not kill, a chocolate bar silently given, a book passed with respect, not as propaganda, but as the practice of democracy. Years later, historians would interview these women, listening to accounts of psychological rebirth, of fractured ideology slowly reknitting into hope. Their words would be born from experience, not just survival, but transformation. We learned that mercy is not weakness, and that to have dignity, you must also give it. In the camps of our enemy, we became human again. For the Americans who oversaw the camps, the legacy was likewise profound. In training young soldiers not to abuse power, the discipline of democracy took on new depth, a test of restraint as essential as any tactical maneuver. One cannot simply fight for freedom, wrote a camp chaplain after Bowie closed. One must also practice it in the presence of those who have been taught to expect only the lash. The sound of freedom, then, is a quiet one. It lives in running water, in the ordinary act of dignity, in the chocolate wrapper passed in silence, in the bread baked each dawn, and the music played at dusk. It does not celebrate victory through spectacle, but through continued acts of mercy, each one a brick in the wall of civilization re-erected after war. Democracy, tested on the battlefield, proved its deepest strength not in conquest but in compassion. The women who left Texas brought home, beyond all expectation, a belief in the possibility of new beginnings. Their trust rebuilt one day at a time, one act of decency at a time. And as the gates of Camp Bowie swung open, the sun shining now on peaceful fields, the lesson lingered far longer than any marching song or uniform could. Freedom's greatest final sound was the ordinary world restored, an abundance not of wealth or power, but of dignity given without demand. It is in these moments, the world over, that the meaning of war changes. The test of a nation's ideology is not carved in iron or fire, but revealed in mercy and patience, in fair rules and clean water, in chocolate shared, and humanity quietly rebuilt. So ends the journey. From terror to renewal, from propaganda to truth, from captivity to self-worth reclaimed, the story reverberates, not in triumph, but in transformation. As dusk falls over Brown County, and the trains depart once more, the echo remains. Freedom survives sometimes, most powerfully in its gentlest, steadiest forms. A drop of water, the taste of chocolate, the sound of a door opening toward home.